Hi everyone. So today's lesson is called Term Time Part 1. What is term time? So as we've done before in the previous lessons, you saw how institutions changed during the British rule in India, many of them being introduced for the first time. We spoke about the civil services, the army, the police and the judiciary. Now we're taking a bit of break from that and going on to concepts in today's lesson. Now understanding terms, not just the ones that are mentioned before you, but in general it's important because the pattern of several competitive exams has changed, and as I've mentioned before, they want you to also know what these terms or any other terms mean and not just the facts or small details behind it. So therefore the aim of lessons called term time will be to get the meanings and the concepts across to you. So let's look at these 4 important concepts from history in today's lesson. Okay, so let's talk about imperialism. Imperialism technically means an empire that is ruled by an emperor who is arbitrary and despotic, which are not very nice terms in effect. And this is partly because any kind of imperialism comes through expansionist policy such as the one that Britain was pursuing at that time. It had been helped in large part by the Industrial Revolution, and that had made it the workshop of the world. And then at the pace at which this empire was growing, it was even said that the sun never sets on the British Empire. So there you go. I mean, those are very, very heavy words. And Hobson then spoke about 3 P's of imperialism. And he said that one is of course pride, the second is prestige, and the third one is pugnacity. So in order to maintain and for imperialism to flourish, all these qualities were said to be essential. And perhaps you can find out what pugnacity is and mention it in the comments. So because it involves some sort of exploitation as well, it can be correlated with the Machiavellian concept of realpolitik or that of Kautilya, who spoke about Sam, Dam, Dand, Bhed. Now see, these kinds of state policies or the way empires work, there is little trust between the rulers and the ruled. Okay, and it denotes that this lack of trust, then obviously if you have to maintain your empire and your rule, you have to pursue it with aggression. Also you need to remember that imperialism then is not just about this kind of traction that you gain by occupying territory or political power, but you also need to acquire the wealth or the capital of that nation and go about using it. So this is what happened in imperialism. Now coming on to empire, since that was mentioned in imperialism. So first thing that you need to know is that an empire is created by a powerful state or nation. Now this is just for the purposes because we are studying history and that too at a glance. But if you were to study something like international relations or political science, you should in fact know that state, nation, country, all these are very different. Okay. And you can always find out what each of them denote. So a nation, for example, would talk about some kind of common identity. A country, on the other hand, may talk about some kind of a geographical identification. A state has certain other features such as fixed territory, fixed population, and control over that population, etc., etc. So you need to read about these as well. What are the characteristics of an empire now? So the characteristics are such that it's usually a significantly large territory. For obvious reasons, you won't imagine a very small piece of land being called an empire. Then unquestioned power over the territory should be there. The empire should normally include smaller states also. Now because it is territorially so expansive, an empire has people of different races, language, values and culture. Generally, we've spoken about this before, that it involves some kind of exploitation as well when it comes to imperialism at least. So generally conquest and violence are used in the creation of an empire. Coercion plays an important role in binding it together because of that lack of trust that we mentioned, and after some time efforts are made to obtain the consent of the ruled. And when you apply all these facts and principles to the case of India and the British in India, you will realize how true they are. So when we talk about, for example, the last point, efforts being made to obtain the consent of the ruled to maintain that empire, that is what was happening. When you saw so many negotiations taking place, for example, between Mahatma Gandhi and between the British, every time there was a fast or an agitation, what was that all about? They were trying to get the Indians to their side ultimately so that the empire could go on. It could not go on by wielding the stick for very long, right? Which is mercantilism, laissez-faire and investment. Now the last term for today's lesson is colonialism. It is derived from the word colony, which means human settlement. Here what happens is that there is settlement of a surplus body of the people of a country in another country. But what you do need to understand is that it is rarely very peaceful, this kind of acquisition or settlement in another person's territory. So for example, the colonization of America by European migrants, the Spanish in South America, the Dutch and the English in South Africa, and the British in India did involve some kind of aggression and forceful acquisition of territory. The conquered territory is usually subordinated totally to the conquering territory. So their polity, economy, culture and ideology is dictated by the people who come to occupy these places. Then it involves a drain of resources from the country that is being ruled. So how does this drain arise? In the case of England and India, what was happening is that they were taking cheap raw material from India and they were sending it to Britain, and then they were manufacturing factory made goods there and dumping them on Indian shores. So it was dual exploitation in a way. Then this kind of unequal exchange also had racial dimensions, ethnic dimensions, where the whites or the British considered themselves to be on a civilizing mission, assuming that the qualities and values that prevailed in the territory of India were obsolete. The colony was called the periphery and the colonizers' area was called the core or metropolis, and Andre Gunder Frank put it very nicely when he said that the metropolis experiences the development of development and the colony or periphery experiences the development of underdevelopment. So what he's trying to say is that the colonizers, they are anyway doing relatively well or relatively better when compared to the territories that they're trying to colonize. Now in the territories, there is development of underdevelopment because after a point they don't have a say in the sort of development that is happening, and you will shortly also find out when we discuss the economic policies of British rulers in India, they were quite exploitative. So no real development happens until the people who are being governed or the ones who are sought to be developed get a say in the state of affairs. R.P. Dutt has spoken in his work India Today about the 3 stages of colonialism. So this is also something that you should know. There are 2 important works related to this that you should be aware of. One is English Debt to India, which is a paper by Dadabhai Naoroji, and then there's England's Debt to India, which is a work by Lala Lajpat Rai. So remember, English Debt to India, Dadabhai Naoroji, and England's Debt to India by Lala Lajpat Rai. And last but not the least, try and understand that there is a difference between the terms modernization and westernization. And what was happening in India was being projected as modernization. It is true that a lot of values and ideas that were being introduced had previously not existed in India, not been mulled over to a great extent, but modernization, for putting that label of modernization for every kind of policy that was being advanced, shows that or projects the ideal that the values that were prevalent in India were obsolete. Whereas when you use the term westernization, you are more accepting of the fact that the East has a different set of values, and what is now happening is westernization. Also, westernization in India was happening at 2 levels. One was imitative westernization, where people would just be taught to imitate. So the subjects would be taught to dress like, or their consumer habits would be molded to suit those of the British. And the other was the kind of intellectual westernization where thoughts and ideas such as humanism, rationality, freedom and secularism would seep into the system. So we'll see how that went, but this was all for term time. I hope it was useful for you, and look forward to making more such lessons. All the best.